So welcome to Module 10, the third in our series dealing with interviews. In the previous two, we looked at the basics and then we kind of worked in a little bit of improvement by adding lists and using containers. This third chapter about interviews will talk specifically about working with entities. Not because entities radically change how interviews work, it's just that we need to learn about two new control types, and we need to learn a little bit about the features hiding behind those control types. And don't worry, this is only the start. We'll be revisiting all of these features at later points during this course. So let's begin by just setting the ground rules. In interviews, when you're using entities, we need to have a little bit of consideration for, first of all, what you want to do with the entity. Do you want to display information, or do you want to let the user add and delete information, because the two are very separate? And do you want to display a child entity or a parent entity? Because let's take the example of you want a candidate and their exams, or you just want to show their exams. All of these things that might sound a bit abstract right now, they'll come into your frame of reference as soon as you start building interviews with entities. Let's make it nice and simple to begin with. There are really two control types you need to think about. The first one is the entity collect. An entity collect, and there's an example on your screen right now, is designed to collect data. What a surprise. And I want you to notice a couple of things. It has over here and here. It has the feature to let you delete and the feature to let you add. So this concept of collection, it also might mean correction and deletion. This is very important because it's the equivalent of what you saw in the debugger when I went in and I created one or more candidates, or I created one or more exams for each candidate. The entity collect comes actually in two basic formats. On the previous screen, you saw a kind of, let's call it a very tabular layout. On this page, you'll notice that it's much more linear. It's just one thing under another. So those of you who are thinking laterally and thinking about what we did in previous modules, you may remember that when we were working with containers, you had different ways of laying things out. So the entity collect offers you two different ways of laying out your information. If I switch back to the slide previously just for 1 second, you can see I have the candidate's name, I have the candidate's home base and their date of birth. I have exactly the same information on this slide, and in fact they are both entity collects. They've simply been configured to have a different layout. Of course, the choice is up to you. Still on the subject of entity collect, when you arrive on a screen ready to enter your candidates or ready to enter your exams, you will by default be looking at a blank page, so to speak. There will be no candidates. The second thing is, as a designer, I have to decide what are the controls that make the most sense. In a tabular layout, where you have essentially columns, it's probably not wise to put in too much data, because after a while, even in the biggest screen, you'll find that it gets a little harder to read. So you might opt for the more linear version. All of this is customizable, as are the delete and add buttons. You can change the text, you can remove them completely. The second kind of control, called the entity container, is sometimes the source of confusion. A collect collects information. A container displays information. It's not the same thing. Notice I've tried to make it as clear as possible. In a container, you can edit existing data, so you could correct the name of a candidate, but there's no add button, and there's no delete button, and there's no functionality that natively that would let you have that. It's about reviewing existing data and, if necessary, making edits to existing data. It's not about adding and deleting. So sometimes you have to choose the right tool for the job. Sometimes you might find that you have both of these on successive screens. For example, on a first screen, you ask people to enter candidates. On the next screen, you display the candidate's name and you ask them to edit some of that data. So you have a collect for the first one and a contain for the second one. You can see in my screenshot, I'll just highlight it here. There we go. This is an entity container, and you'll notice that the first column in the container is not an input. It's not a text box, it's not a radio button, it's just a piece of text. So it's a label. So this label is doing something very, very clever. This label is going to display the name of the candidate, but not let you edit it. So in a sense, what you see in front of you here is the ability to look at a candidate who already exists and edit some of the information about them, but not edit their name, because for whatever reason, we've decided that we're not going to let people edit the candidate's name right here. So by being clever in which one you use, you can actually find that a container and a collect, quite often on successive pages, works out quite well. Now that we have the basics down, let's talk a little bit about when we actually place this on a screen. In my demo, which I'll do shortly, we'll see that placing entity collects and entity containers on a screen will result in the interview making certain decisions or making certain adjustments. For example, if I was to create a new screen and I was to place the candidate's exams on that screen, let's call it an entity collect, then the screen entity, as far as the interview is concerned, the screen entity is not the exam, it's actually the candidate. So you'll often see that when you drag and drop things into the screen, something called the screen entity is affected. If it's not making much sense right now, don't worry about it. Let's just say that there's a concept of what should the interview be focusing on, and we call that a screen entity, and I'll show you it in the demo. The second point is an interesting one, is let's suppose that you add an exam entity collect to your screen. So you're collecting data about the exams that your candidates have taken. And then you drag and drop the candidate's name and you place it inside the collect for the exams. You'd see an error message. Intelligence Advisor would say, hang on a minute, you told me you wanted to collect exams and you've just put the candidate's name in there. The candidate's name doesn't belong to the entity called the candidate's exams. So there's a notion of you've got to put the attributes in the right place, otherwise Intelligent Advisor will simply refuse to display them because it doesn't make sense what you're trying to do. Still on the subject of showing existing data, one of the most useful things that you could do is if you're showing existing data, let's say, for example, you want to show the candidates who've shown up for the interview. Maybe you don't want to show all of the candidates. Maybe you only want to show certain candidates. Let's take the example we saw earlier. Some candidates who are star candidates have scored 100% in at least one exam. Maybe you want to dedicate a screen or a part of a screen to only showing you the star candidates. So we're going to use a technique that you've already seen before. We can select our entity our entity container, and then we can use, in this case, it's called show if. You may remember we saw show if, hide if when we were looking at other controls. So we can say show this or hide this if, so we can filter. So you'll notice I've clicked the filter button and simply said, okay, I want to see if there's at least one candidate who scored 100%. Because if there's nobody to show, because no one scored 100%, then don't bother showing me an empty box. So in this case, I'm simply saying, don't show me the container if there's nobody. There's nothing more frustrating than going onto a page of an interview and seeing headings and nothing, because there's nothing to show. So I've decided to say, okay, this is going to be a hidden if there's nobody who scores this. In some cases, you will also want to, for example, nest data. Make sure that when you're showing an exam, you also remind people for which candidate this exam applies. Because if you have 2 candidates and 6 exams split evenly between them, the last thing you want to see is candidate 1 with the exams belonging to candidate 2. So you're going to need to make special effort to make sure that you, first of all, adjust the layout so that it's clear. You might notice here that I put a big label here to say candidate. So this is going to be the candidate. And underneath, I've got the details of their exams. But there's a unique feature that I've also added. I've filtered the list of exams so that I only see the exams for the correct candidate, which avoids having one candidate with 6 exams and then another candidate with another 6 exams, when it should be the first one with 3 and the second one with 3. So filtering lets me adjust the output. We'll see filtering again in another module much later in this class to do more sophisticated things, but right now it's going to be useful when you're building multi-layer screens. Coming back to the subject of this interview, interviews with entities, we need to revisit the concept of an interview goal. You may remember, and if you didn't, we'll see it in a minute, that in every interview so far, on the last screen, it has said, it has given an explanation of global goals. And we had this drop-down feature. Here it is here. You can see this. We had this thing here. When you're dealing with entities, you need to maybe reconsider what is the global goal of your interview. Let me explain. Earlier, when we only ever had one candidate, the goal was simple. Will the candidate be able to fly the plane? But now we have multiple candidates. So what is the goal of the interview? We could say, well, the goal of the interview is there should be at least one person capable of flying the plane, which is different to saying the person flies the plane. Now we have to adjust the global goal to say something like, the plane is ready to depart, and you should recognize the function that I'm using. For at least one of the candidates, the candidate is authorized to fly the plane. So as long as we have one person at least who's authorized to fly it, we're good to go. So I've adjusted the global goal. For those of you who are thinking in terms of attributes, I've simply created a new global attribute and given it a calculation, and the result of that calculation will be what drives my interview. Is there at least one person to fly the plane? So that's actually quite a lot of things to demo. So what I'm going to do in this demo is I'm going to demo part of it, and then I'm going to load up a version where I've completed the work. We're going to look at entity collects and entity containers. We're going to look at how to nest, and we're going to look at filtering and setting visibility of items, just like we did before. So, on with the demo. As you can see, in my project, I've made a few adjustments. I've created some screens, which are, for the most part, currently blank. I've added labels to remind myself what it is I'm going to do. This is a nice feature. You can always delete the label later. It's handy when you're doing a demo for someone and you can't remember how many different things you have to do. So let's take a look at the first screen I want to work with, which is we're going to add a place where you can collect candidates. So I'm going to go to New Input, and I'm going to select the candidates, because what I want to do here is I want to get the candidates. I double click it, as we've seen before, and we get an empty box. Well, it's almost empty, I suppose. And it says, collects instances of the entity, the candidate. We'll talk about the rest of the details in a moment. Add new instance, and it has a delete button. Well, you know what? I'm going to double click that and say add candidate, because add new instance really isn't doing it for me. But what data do I want my end user to actually fill in? Well, I want them to provide me with the name of the candidate, the date of birth of the candidate, and their home base. I want you to notice here on the left-hand side that the three attributes, you can see that they're inside this entity. If I was to drag this somewhere else, I might end up getting an error message to say, well, hang on, I'm not sure how to do this. It's important that you use the left-hand side of the screen as a reference point to make sure that the attributes are in the right place. The candidate entity collect is almost good to go. As I mentioned earlier, there are two different ways to display this. I am going to switch now to tabular mode, and you'll see that I now have one kind of a spreadsheet look and feel. I also will take the opportunity to remind you that you can actually edit all of these, because especially in a column output, you don't want too many things, too much text. Date of birth, home base. I'll remind you one final time that this does not affect in any way the attributes. It's simply how you're displaying it in the screen. And I'm quite pleased with that, so I can now go ahead and delete the control that reminded me what I was going to do. So I'm going to go straight into debug, and we'll take a look at how this collect works. We'll do a quick demo of the debug, and then we'll return to our interview and look at an entity container. So I'm going to go ahead and jump straight into the candidates. So it says add candidate. I click on it, and it says, okay, what's the name? What's the date of birth? I think I might have to change that. And let's say that this candidate is based in Charles de Gaulle in Paris. And let's say we have a second candidate whose date of birth is, and Janet is based in Atlanta. So you can see that the entity is all about collecting data. I can add as many as I want, and I can delete those that I suddenly decide I don't want. And that's what an entity collect does. If I click the next button, it's because this error message, because I skipped this screen at the front. But if I go and enter the airline name, which I forgot about, airlines, let's go there we go. And I go to the data tab, just to remind you that I could have done that by actually doing what we did in earlier and adding manually instances. So the result is the same, but of course the nice part is here I get to see it in an HTML view, and I get to feel what my audience will actually see. So far so good. We've asked for the collection of our candidates. Well, what about the candidate health data? I made a deliberate choice not to put too much in that list because it would have ended up as being quite crowded. So I now want to continue working with the candidates, but I want to add more data. So this time round, it's not about collecting data, it's about using a container. And I'll say, okay, I want to go back to the candidates, and I want to add a label, and I want to add some extra data. So let's get the health data, which was their vision score, if I remember rightly. So the candidate already exists. So I'm going to use this label, and I'm going to do something very interesting. I'm going to tap the percentage key, and up pops a number of attributes. These attributes have been prepared for what we call substitution. You may remember I mentioned substitution a while ago. If you didn't, it doesn't matter. But what does this tell me? It means that if I was to say candidate, at runtime, when the interview is in front of my audience, they won't see candidate, they will see the name of a candidate. Okay? So this is a very useful feature when you want to display information, but you don't want to give people the chance to edit it, because I chose a label, and the label is not editable, it's just text. If you're interested in this concept, you can at any time go to any attribute that you might be interested in. For example, I might be interested in the candidate's home base, and we can add what we call a name. Sometimes we call it a public name. We'll call this home base. Home base, I've added an underscore because public names have certain restrictions because they're not really meant for public consumption, even though they're called public names. It says use percentage home base to show this attribute's value on a screen. So if I wanted to now, I could go back to my interview and I could say candidate based in percentage the candidate's home base. So inside a label, you can mix and match static text and dynamic text, and you can put them in one label, two labels, three labels, and whatever you want. So now I have extra data being collected. It's probably not very obvious, but there is a difference in these two icons. This icon has a little red streak running through it. This one doesn't. Yes, I know you'd need a microscope to see it, but there is a difference between the two. That's a collect, and that's a container. As before, I'm going to switch this to tabular mode, because frankly, I think tabular mode often works better on small screens. Okay. I want you to notice at the top of the page that even though I am dealing with candidates, it says the screen entity is global. It will show all instances of the candidate. Translating that into something fairly simple, it should remind you of this structure. It's saying, if I position myself at global, I'll be able to show you all of the candidates. It's related to the hierarchical nature of your entities, and it's indicating that you're going to see all the candidates on this page. One last example, we need to display the candidate's competencies. And we'll pop in another layer, collect, the candidate, and we'll add a new label, and we'll add, do they have a pilot's license? When was their check ride? And do they have this? And do they have that? And that'll do for now. I'm going to leave this one as a entity container in portrait mode so that we can see the difference when we run the debugger. So this is technically the same as the previous screen, it's just in portrait mode. Our final stop, or our penultimate stop, is the exams. The exams, you'll remember, are a child of the candidate. So I want to collect exam data. So I want to go to the collection, I want input, and I've decided to add this, so we'll say add exam. Notice that the screen entity says it's the candidate, because in order to show you the exams, it sets itself to the parent. It says, okay, if you want to talk about exams, I need to focus on each candidate. As before, we need to make sure that there is data that the end user can actually see. So I'm going to add the candidate's exam, the result, and the passing score. And I'll set this to a tabular layout as before. And you're thinking, okay, cool. So let's put in exam code, result, passing score. Okay. And you'll notice that if necessary, I can adjust these because not all data has the same width, of course. But now we have a problem, or rather, you probably guess what the problem is. Nowhere on this screen right now do we actually mention who the candidate is. We just say, give me some exams. Let's see what happens when we go into debug. You may remember I entered two candidates, Janet and Bob. Bob, now I'm able to enter his vision score and Janet's vision score. Notice the usefulness of the label because now I have a static label reminding me of who I'm working with. I have the competencies. Notice that in portrait mode, it has Bob and then it has Janet. So in a tabular mode, you get everybody as rows. In a portrait mode, you get whole sections. So this is not, in my experience, always a very good use of screen real estate. So let's say, yes, they have. License expiry date, let's say that it's 01/01/2024. Let's say Janet does have a valid license and her last check ride was only yesterday. She does have a license and her expiry date, we'll set it to 2026. And we'll move on to next. Did you notice what I had to do to get to the next button? I had to scroll back up. So even in a larger screen, this is the kind of thing that we want to avoid, is people having to go up and down looking for where they navigate. There are ways of mitigating that, but I think the portrait layout is best used wisely. So now I'm going to go ahead and talk about the exams. Let's go straight to the exams. Candidate exams and candidate exams. 2 pages ready for me to enter the exams. But you can see the problem. I don't know Is this Bob's exams or is it... Okay, I know which one it is because there's only two, but there's nothing on this page here to remind me who it is I'm supposed to be working with. So when you're working with nesting, when you're working with children of entities, always remember that even though you're focused on the candidate's exam, it makes very good sense to add, I beg your pardon, to add a nice big label here and say, I want you to remind people who the candidate is. Because without that, we won't know whose exams are which. Again, look on the left-hand side. I made a very conscious effort to not put the candidate inside the candidate's exam. Watch what happens. I'm going to drag it in by accident. And it's ended up as a column in my list. But when I arrive on this screen, the list will be empty. So this won't actually be as useful as popping it above. And let's take the opportunity to show you that on the toolbar we have a variety of predefined styles. If you don't like the text of this style, or I beg your pardon, if you don't like the styling, you can click Styles and you have access to all of these. So let's say, for example, that heading number 1 I'm not happy with. I want heading number 1 to be red. Okay. My heading is now red. I have a warning that I am not conforming to the best practice guidelines for accessibility, so I can either go back and change the color, or I can temporarily switch off those warnings. So now whenever I use heading 1, I'll get red text in this project. Super. The final page we're going to do, the final screen, is the question of star candidates. You may remember that if somebody scores 100%, well, they're pretty much a star candidate. I think they're well worth visiting, if you like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new control, and it's going to be the candidates again. And I'm going to add just a label that says the name of the candidate. That'll do for now. The problem is this entity container doesn't know that you want to only show star candidates. For me, there are two things I'd like to do. The first thing I'd like to do is I'd say filter this and show me if the candidate scored 100% at least once. So it's leveraging a Boolean attribute that we made earlier to say, okay, don't show them unless they have met this criteria. Now that I've adjusted the filter to only show candidates who meet that criteria, I'm going to take it one step further just to remind us that it's possible, that I could even say, well, don't bother showing it at all unless we have someone who is approved to fly. Again, I'm using Boolean attributes to enable me to show or hide components. It's a key part of making your interview dynamic. Now that I've done all those little demos, let's rewind and load up one that I already prepared earlier, and we'll go through quite a few different variations on that. So this is the final version. I've created a screen for capturing the airline data. And the airline data is a unique proposition within our interview, so it's a worthwhile stop. The airline data plays no role at all in any of the logic we've put into place. Nowhere do we question or create criteria or anything like that in relation to building these set of rules. So I have set this screen to show always. Because if I leave it at show if relevant, I'm sure you've guessed what will happen. Intelligent Advisor will say, this is not relevant because it doesn't help me answer any of your goals. Nowhere do you talk about the airline. So if you have an information page, or a page that collects something that isn't actually being used in your rules, don't forget you might need to change that so that it still shows up. Otherwise, Intelligent Advisor will simply hide it and say it's not relevant. I'll show you what we saw earlier. I created a tabbed layout to collect the candidates. Then I have a tabbed layout to show the existing candidates, and I'll add the label. There we go. So this is the container, and this is the collect. In the competencies, I've opted for a tabbed layout again, and I am still showing the existing candidates, but asking for further information. And you'll notice that I've adjusted the column size here, and I'm going to go right on now and say, well, actually, I think a checkbox would work better. I don't personally, but and I'll say a checkbox, just to remind you that you can change those. And how about this? The pilot's license expiry. Well, surely there's no point in showing the pilot's license expiry date if you don't have a license. So we could say, let's show this if the pilot has a valid pilot's license is true. So we will avoid using too much space with an unnecessary attribute. Let's carry on. Over in the exams, I collect the exam data. As we saw in an earlier exercise, I've added some values now to make make adding exams easier. I've added exam codes using a list that we talked about earlier. I have removed the add and the remove buttons. So to do that, I simply clicked there, and you can see up here it says I can have it or not have it. Why have I done that? It's because I suddenly realized as I was doing this that there are only two exams, P101 and P102. So why don't we say that when you reach the candidate's exam, we don't bother showing these buttons because, frankly, there's no point to them because they are always there. And we could also set the number of blank instances to 2. And you're thinking, huh? Let me put it this way. Which would you rather have? A blank page where you know you're going to create 2 rows and you have to click Add Exam twice, or a page that automatically shows you 2 blank rows ready for you to enter your exams? I think I know which one I'd prefer. So this concept of blank instances lets you pre-draw the screen with the requisite number of instances. You'll notice from my little window here that you can be a dynamic or a static number. I've set it to a static number, but you could have some magic calculation that calculates a number and comes up with a number. Finally, over here, the star candidates, you may remember this. The star candidates, I've said, the star candidates, I will filter, and I could say, show me anyone who scored at least 100 at least once. So they're the star candidates. And I've added an extra screen right at the bottom called Review Candidates. I've called it Review Candidates because this is good practice in my opinion. Let people review what it is they've just done. Don't imagine that they'll remember or want to click back just to remind themselves. So I've done this for 2 reasons. One, because I think it makes good sense. Also because you can see that I've clearly nested the candidate and the candidate's exam. The reason being is because when I get to the candidate's exam, of course, I want to make sure that I'm showing the candidate's exams so that each candidate shows up with the candidate. So it's another idea of filtering the data to show something sensible. And I've added some labels to do clever things with substitution, like we saw earlier on. So let's see what gives. To avoid you having to wait while I make 1,000 spelling mistakes entering data, I should have, ready for use, a saved scenario, which I remember showing you earlier on. Fingers crossed. So the airline is Silver Airways. Fleur and Whalon. This is their data. If I uncheck this, no reason to ask you about the pilot's license expiry if you don't have one. Here are the results for Whalon. And here are the candidate reviews. Fleur has passed both. Whalon, I'm afraid, failed one of his exams. I'll go back and show you the star candidates. Fleur is the star candidate because Fleur is the only one who had 100% in one of her exams. And we'll go to the end. The plane is not ready to depart. So my global goal is not met. Why? Because neither of them are authorized to fly the plane. Fleur's license expires too soon. And Wayne, because he doesn't, oh, crikey, yes, he failed an exam. So this really shows us the usefulness of an explanation. When you have a complex rule set, and this is not complex by any means, but you started to see that there's a bunch of rules all happening, you start to need this feature to be able to drill down and find out what's going on. So I could go back to my candidate exams, back to my competency data, and say, well, Fleur, I beg your pardon, let's go back. The plane, Fleur failed because her license expiry date is too soon. So let's go back to her license expiry date, and let's put it in 2026. Still not ready to depart. Still not authorized. So this is a great exercise in debugging because it's saying, okay, I have a problem with the license expiry date. So you're thinking, hang on a minute, what's happened here? Anyone would think I planned this, and I did. Now we need to debug the behavior of our interview. We think Fleur should be authorized, but why isn't she? This is an opportunity for us to switch back to the data tab, to go and find Fleur, and find, it says, Fleur is not authorized to fly the plane. And we're surprised at that. Right-click, show decision. She doesn't satisfy the competency criteria. Okay, why doesn't, license expiry date is 01/26, and that sounds pretty good to me. I'm going to right-click and say, show me where I talk about this. And I think I can see it straight away. I'm going to pin this so it doesn't disappear. I'm going to click on this to open the Word file. And I'm sure you can already see what the problem is. This says that you've satisfied the competency criteria if you have a valid license, the license is for the correct aircraft type, and the license expiry date is before or equal to the current date. So basically what I'm saying is I want someone whose license is expired, which is probably not what I want when I'm getting on a plane. So I'm going to adjust that to a greater than, and I'm actually going to take it a step further. I'm going to say, well, I'd like people to at least have a little bit of time left on their license before I get in the plane. So I'm going to go to the rule assistant, and I'm going to do something like add days current date 10. So I'm saying you must have at least 10 days left on your license before I'll get in the plane with you. I make the change. You'll notice that when we return to the debugger, we have a message telling us that changes have been detected. There's no need to close the debugger and reopen it. Simply click apply. The decision tab goes blank because things have changed. We can go to our interview and say, oh, the plane is ready to depart now. Okay, because Fleur is authorized to fly the plane because, and I see the breakdown. And if I go to my data tab, you'll notice that my global goal of the plane is ready to depart. I can say show decision, and I'll actually be able to drill down and say, okay, Fleur is authorized because of this, she passed all the exams, wow, and she passed all the competency criteria. So you've probably worked this out now, is that the decision tab is kind of showing you the same as this, only it's showing it you on demand whenever you need it as part of your debugging efforts. Wow, that was quite an amazingly interesting interview to debug, but also an interesting interview to put together. And working with entities will require a bit of experimentation, there's no doubt. It takes a little bit of time to get used to. And of course, we're only here on the first part of our adventure, so we'll be visiting these interviews many times again in the future modules of this course. But that's it for our demonstration of interviews with entities.